Hey, welcome back to our study this week. We're in Colossians chapter 2, looking verses at 18 and 19. Today, Paul's been talking about not accepting things from these other people. And the Colossians were to believe him and Christ about who they are and what they're supposed to be doing. And so last time we talked about how they were not to accept judgment from other people. Because they're not keeping the ceremonial laws. And so that's something they weren't supposed to do. Those were, he said, were just shadows, but now you have the substance. Why go after the shadow if you have the substance? So today we're talking about verses 18 and 19, and we're going to see that Paul doesn't want them to accept disqualification from them either. So not only these people were teaching that the Christians ought to syncretize the true faith with the practices that Jesus fulfilled, which is the ceremonial law, but they wanted them to go into mysticism as well. They were insisting that they practice asceticism. The word here is literally voluntary humility, which doesn't sound bad. Humility is a good thing, but this is a reliance on works to make one more acceptable to God. In other words, it's legalism. This is an outward change of behavior without an inward, internal, inner man heart change. This usually comes with boasting. You've all met legalists before. Maybe some of us struggle with this. Oh, I haven't seen a rated R movie in 20 years because of all the nudity and swearing we boast. But didn't you say you struggle with pornography? So that's the idea. You boast about certain things that you have ceremonially brought into your life, but you have all these, but the inward part is not any different. You can put outward restrictions on yourself, but they all have appearance of holiness, while the heart is left to wallow in its evil. So you can just kind of cut off different things in your life to try to say, well, look at this, I'm changed, but ultimately your heart is not any different. Is still attracted to the in and stuck in the evil and sin. So asceticism, trying to just remove yourself of all outward pleasures and things like that, doesn't work, because you can become a monk like Martin Luther and still be a rotten, dirty sinner like he was. You realize like he could do all the ascetics things and still be a horrible person. It's true. So now Paul also mentions the worship of angels here. This is a proper reverence toward, there is a proper reverence, right? There is a reverence, there is a honoring that we should give to the ministering spirits, but worship belongs to the Lord alone. As we see in Revelation 19 and 22, when the apostle tried to worship the angel, he said, "You must not do that. I am a fellow servant." Now there's respect and honor due to angels, but never worshiping them. They are not creatures that deserve worship. Only God deserves worship. And so they see themselves, as they say themselves, I am a fellow servant. I serve God just like you serve God. And so I don't deserve worship. It'd be like two different servants worshiping each other, which is kind of ridiculous. And so they might be having different roles. They might be playing different parts. They might have different authority too. One might be under the other, but still they're all servants, right? Back in the day, you had different levels of servants. If you ever watched, what's that show? Downton Abbey, it had, give you insight into the different roles of servants back in, the early 1900s. That they had all this hierarchy of servants. You have the head of the household, and you have different levels of butler and footmen and all these kind of different levels of authority. But it wouldn't make any sense to be like to worship one. They're all servants. So even to give an honor that would be due to the Lord of the house doesn't make any sense to give to another servant. Still a servant. There's different authority, respect, and honor, but they're not the highest person in the house. Same thing spiritually. We're all spirit beings. Angels are spirit beings as well. but we're all servants of the Most High God. Now, another way these false teachers were disqualifying the true believers was by going on about visions, puffed up without reason by their sensuous minds. One teacher, apologist, Justin Peters, he calls these people heavenly, they're involved in heavenly tourism, right? They talk about going to heaven or seeing and talking with Jesus, having these visions. You might have seen these shows on TV or on the internet. They go on in detail about all these things they claim to have seen in heaven or in hell. They talk about all these private conversations that they have with Jesus Christ. Paul says that these people are puffed up without reason by their sensuous minds. Now, some people will point to Paul and say, well, he had visions and he talked about them. It is true that Paul had visions and that he did speak of them. But if you read 2 Corinthians 12, you can see his explanation of the difference between him and the false teachers. He saw a stark difference between them. First, he's an apostle by the will of Jesus Christ. He held an office that was unique. None of these people today are apostles. Some might claim they're apostles. Some take on that title falsely. They are not apostles. Apostle had to see the risen Jesus Christ. They say they seen, it's like, but these are just visions, and how do I know that you were talking about? But the apostles were chosen by Christ, and that makes a difference too, because these people weren't chosen in the same way that the apostles, the original 12 plus Paul, were chosen. They were recognized as, there's a special group of people called the apostles. They were aligned with the prophets, and so you only have those men were the chosen ones. That's it. We shouldn't assume the other apostles. That's a whole different other argument and lesson and conversation we could have. They're not apostles. They don't fulfill the requirement. Not everyone that was there fulfilled the requirement either. Right? When they were replacing Judas, remember that story in the beginning of Acts? And that wasn't like, hey, everyone can be apostle because we all saw Jesus, we all walked with him. We should all be apostles. We're all part of this group. And it wasn't like that, was it? So I don't know why all of a sudden people today are like, hey, I'm an apostle too. Well, wait a minute. Back there, they had to decide between Matthias and Joseph. What's his name? Joseph. I can't even remember the guy's name now. I just drew a blank. Anyway, you can look it up in Acts. Matthias was the guy they chose. I can't remember the other guy. Man, I know it, but it's just not coming. But anyway, it's like, so why are we thinking we're all apostles now when they could only choose one? And then Paul says he was untimely, born of the apostles. He was, specifically chosen to be the apostle to the Gentiles, to bridge that gap between the Jews and Gentiles. And that was it. We don't have anybody else. So when the apostle John passed away, that was it. That's the end. So, but all these people were, hey, I'm an apostle. I can get these visions and do all this kind of stuff too. No, they were given visions because they had to, that validated their apostleship. And Paul received those too. So he's an apostle. We shouldn't equate ourselves or even try to assume that we could be close to him. There was a special office. They were a gift to us in the church. Second, he refrained from speaking about so others would not think more of him because of the visions. He said that. I don't talk about this because other people would, look at that and say, well, look at Paul. He had this great vision. So he really didn't talk about it, really. He mentions it in the letter, but in order to say, I'm not talking about it. Also, God allowed the thorn in his flesh to keep him from being puffed up, to being conceited in this. So Paul would rather boast in his weakness than go on in detail about what he had seen. There's the difference, really. He's not going up there, I'm going to go on TV and going to talk about all these visions and amazing things I've had. He just doesn't talk about it. Why? Because he doesn't have to. He didn't need to. And God gave a thorn in his flesh to keep him humble. So you compare what he says here, compare what he says there in 2 Corinthians 12 to what you see here, with those that go about like parading their visions and I've seen this, all that's what Paul says. These people are puffed up, they're conceited, they're boasting about their visions. That's what all these people do. I'm going to go online and talk about this vision I had. No, don't talk about it. You don't need to talk about it. You don't need to share it with anybody. You don't need to. If Paul felt that he didn't need to, why do you think you need to? That's what the false teachers were doing. Now you've just put yourself in the league with false teachers. If you've had a vision of God, then keep it to yourself. No one needs to hear that. That should stay with you. If you actually had one, I doubt that actually happens, but if it did, keep it to yourself. So instead of being disqualified, the Christians are to hold fast to Jesus, who is the head of the church. Because, what they were doing was trying to say, well, I've had this vision. You didn't. You were a horrible Christian. You're not a real Christian if you haven't had visions and dreams and all these things happening to you. If you don't have all these nudges and promptings and all this kind of stuff that people throw in there, if you haven't heard a voice from God, if you haven't heard the audible voice from God, then you are not a real Christian. And that's what they're saying. It's like, well, no. Paul says, don't be disqualified by them. You cannot let them disqualify you. Christians are to hold fast to Jesus, who is the head of the church, and by which each person in the church has their own function, as nourished and knit together. They grow with a growth that is from God. Paul loves this image of the church being like a human body. The church is like a living organism. It's not a business. With Jesus at its head, all the other parts function properly and are fed just as it was intended. So he said you can't be disqualified because you didn't get these visions and all this other kind of stuff. If people are going around bragging about that, then they're out of order. But you don't have to worry about you can't be disqualified by them, because not everyone has the same gift. Not everyone has the same ability. Not everyone has the same talents. Not everyone has the same personality. So don't be putting that on someone else. You can't judge two people. Don't be disqualified by other people. And that's what's sad, especially in when we look at leaders of the church. Like, there's men that are qualified, godly men, but because they have a personality that may not mesh with everyone, then we disqualify them. It's like, why do we do that? Or there might be someone who is not a great speaker, and that we disqualify them from leadership. It's like, just because they're not a great speaker doesn't mean you can disqualify them. Like, come on. And then we disqualify Christians. Like, well, they're not able to come all the time, so they're not real. They're not real believers. We need to stop disqualifying each other. Only God can do that. Only God can say, nope, I never knew you. He's the only one who can do that. So we need to stop doing that. All right, so we'll end there for today, and tomorrow we'll look at verses 20 through 23, and we're going to talk about how Paul is saying, don't submit to them. Don't submit to their regulations, their commands. Submit to Christ alone. Let's come back for that.